Hello, everybody. My name is Mary Cole. This is the Good Story Podcast. And with me, I have Lisa Stringfellow, middle grade author. Lisa, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Well, let's dive in. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your book? Very
Yeah.
exciting, newish release.
Yes. So I am a middle grade author. As you said, my book, A Comb of Wishes, came out on February 8th of 2022 with HarperCollins Quill Tree Books. It's a fantasy set in the Caribbean, an invented Caribbean island, about a young girl who is recently grieving the loss of her mother and stumbles upon a mermaid's comb. And the mermaid makes contact with her and gives her the opportunity to make a wish in exchange for returning the comb. And of course, there's just one thing the main character wants more than anything, which is to have her mom back. So that is the premise of the story. Magic ensues.
Magic ensues. And of course, this is a play on this mythological object of the mermaid's comb. Is that, well, actually, before we start talking about the book, you sort of, you didn't mention much about yourself. Who
I
is Lisa
didn't.
the person?
So I am also a teacher. So I live in the Boston area and I teach middle school English. So I have fifth and sixth grade. This is my 28th year of teaching. So I've been teaching a
Wow.
long time. I love that grade level. And I, like to do writing with my students as well. And yeah, that's kind of like my passion between writing myself and writing with my students.
Well, we'll definitely talk about the synergies there because you have this sort of wonderful ecosystem in which your creative work and your professional work and sort of the people that you interact with all day, every day, there's a confluence there, definitely. But let's talk about the book. So I was going to ask, you are playing with the magical object, the mermaid's comb, which has a pretty long history in mythology. So were you inspired by that, or how did you come up with the idea for this premise?
Yeah, I have always loved like mermaid lore and stories. And so when I was thinking about writing this book, I started my first draft back in 2013. So a while ago. And I had read a book called The Tale of Emily Winsnap, which was about a mermaid, a girl who discovers that she's part mermaid. And that was just a fun, lighthearted book. And so I thought I would love to write a mermaid story too. But I also had recently read around that same time Coraline by Neil Gaiman, and which is a totally different kind of book, kind of dark and
I was going to
atmospheric.
say, I'm struggling to see the parallels.
And so I thought I would love to tell a story about a mermaid, but she's kind of a little bit of a scary mermaid and a little bit of an antagonist. So that was kind of where that came in. And in my research, thinking about like all the elements of mermaids that I wanted to include, combs obviously are on that list. There are things like mirrors associated with mermaids' combs, wishes. I tried to incorporate elements from, well-known stories. So, Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. Obviously, a lot of people know the Disney version and maybe have read the original fairy tale. And,
You're in
so
for
there,
a surprise.
I know. So there's elements of that story, in the book as well. But yeah, I wanted to lean on the familiar, but also make it a little different than maybe people have seen.
So I think that's really interesting because I am often speaking with people who choose to do adaptations or they choose to pick something from mythology or history or popular culture and run with it. So, what was your approach to maybe doing something a little bit more unique with your take on a mermaid story?
hmm So, one of the first decisions I made was to set the story in the Caribbean and to also have my characters be Black characters that live in the islands. Part of that connects to my heritage. My dad was from Barbados. And so, growing up here in the United States, I still was surrounded by, food and culture and music. Um, and then there's aspects of the Caribbean and just the history of the islands that you can't quite escape kind of where things came from. And so the slave trade obviously is like a big part of like the history of where, the people came from and stories and traditions that they brought with them. So even in the fantastical parts of the story, there's still like awareness and recognition of some of like that traumatic history. When the character does research into like where this mysterious comb may have come from, she talks about with people that, there were ships and there were shipwrecks and what were these ships carrying and all of that. So I think, some of that weaving in real history with kind of like the fantastic and the tropes that we're familiar with was something that I wanted to do and make sure that I nodded to those things that, really need to be part of the story if you're going to set it where it is.
But you chose a fictional island.
I did. So everything about the island of St. Rita is inspired by the real island of Barbados. And so I wanted to have kind of that creative freedom to change things around or be okay if I didn't get some things quite right, that someone who, my family who still lives there would be like, wait a minute, that geography seems a little different. Um, but yes, it's definitely, from down to the expressions that people use or foods and music draws from Barbados. But it's an island, a name that I made up. So a lot of people have told me like, "Oh, I googled St. Rita and I couldn't find it." I'm like, "Nope, I made it up."
So I like that. It's sort of, you're very intentional about weaving in your background and real history,
Mhm.
but you wanted to take some creative liberties. You wanted a little bit of freedom, just like, setting something in a very real place. You're right. It's sort of beholden to people with deep knowledge of that place. People have certain expectations. This is a clever way to, run alongside Barbados and what's familiar there, but still be able to sort of make your own little universe there.
Yeah, and I think also, being a member of like the diaspora of like the islands kind of also, puts me in a little bit of a different position. Like I, you know, feel part of everything, but I'm also, not living there. I wasn't born there. I know it kind of through my family and through, my visits, but it's not firsthand in the same way. And so thinking about that was part of my thought process too.
That's really interesting. So it I guess there's the question of lived experience, and almost like you feel comfortable, you feel that it is a part of you, but maybe not a firsthand part.
Yeah, and I think it's, there's real experiences, and I know, different authors of color I've heard talk about, not being whatever that identity is enough, not feeling that sometimes, and, feeling kind of like the weight of like getting things right and critique, but also feeling like you want to own your experience as, your
Yeah.
truth as well. And so, yeah, but definitely want to like make it something that everyone, who's familiar with the islands would say, oh, I recognize that, or, that's something that reminds me of when I've been there or what I experienced. So
I think that's a really interesting sort of balance of owning our experience as like a second generation or a member of the diaspora who happens to be in Boston, and how to navigate that bit of distance. Very interesting. So, getting back to the fantasy element. So, there's very much an underpinning that comes from reality. And you wanted to work with mermaids because they are fabulous. You maybe wanted a little bit more of a sinister mermaid in the vein of a Gaiman mermaid rather than a Disney mermaid. So how did you, because sometimes when we think about working with some of these fantasy elements, we're like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if my character was a mermaid? But you very specifically went in the direction of mermaid as antagonist, and the character sort of stumbles upon this entire fantasy world that maybe snuck up on her. She wasn't expecting.
I think, what was a part of like my process was thinking about, I did have this mermaid character that I wanted whoever my main character was going to develop into to interact. And I wanted my main character to have that trope of making a wish on a mermaid's comb. But then and I'm very much, I think, more of a premise person. Like when I start writing, thinking of like the idea of something and like, what is it going to be about? And then start thinking about who the characters are that would be part of that story. But when I started thinking about the girl or the character who would be interacting, making this wish, that was when I guess I could dig a little bit deeper into like, what would she want? Like, what would a 12-year-old want and what's important to them? Um, and realizing that for it to be as weighty as I wanted, it would be a loss, something that she wanted back. And so that's kind of how I started developing Keela's character. And there's a connection that even she and Ophidia, who's the mermaid, both kind of have their arcs in the story and change and grow a little bit, and they're connected to one another. But yeah, that's kind of the avenue I really was interested in exploring.
Well, I love the almost just delicious decision and sacrifice that goes into this impossible wish. It's not just, I want to meet my favorite musician, or, I want the boy at school to like me or the girl at school to like me or whatever. It's, I want to bring my mother back. And it is just this primal wound that she has, this grief. And it is almost a Faustian bargain. It is sort of she's going to have to sacrifice in order to even try and make a wish like that. And it sounds like she finds a willing player to engage in that kind of dance.
Yeah, and that was kind of fun to explore the whole idea of, magic having a cost and how much you would be willing to, pay. I'm a big fan of other like fantasy TV shows, and I remember when I was in the middle of like drafting, like Once Upon a Time was a TV show that was on that I used to love to watch, and they always talk Rumpelstiltskin about, magic always has a cost, but that's in so many fairy tales too. And I think just even with world building, uh, resources and things that I've read and talked to other people about, that there always is like this ripple effect that things shouldn't ever be free and easy, and the character can decide what they're willing and then what the consequences. And I think Keela, she hears that, but she doesn't quite really internalize that at the beginning. And that's part of her growth too, because she's feeling very like it's personal to her and she wants what she wants. And it's part of her regret over, things that she said to her mother, before her mother's accident, that, you know, I hate you, because her life had changed and her mother was busy and working and asking more of her to help. And I think that's very normal for kids to kind of be resentful when things change and, things aren't the way they're used to. And so, she wants her mother back because she wants her life to be what it was. And, then she kind of has to adapt to what the consequences are.
And kids, it's developmentally appropriate to also, have an outsized feeling of responsibility and, to feel, I mean, they have main character syndrome because they are the center of their universe, even when they're a main character. So to be dealing with all of those emotions, and then it must be very tempting to be presented with a magical solution. But as with so many magical bargains or magical offerings or wishes that aren't worded maybe exactly correctly,
Mhm.
there is a flip side. And so you say that your antagonist, our evil mermaid, has an arc as well. So while you were crafting your character, your protagonist arc with this loss, these changes, this what if, this deep regret, what's going on for the mermaid?
I think that it's really almost like, again, with that theme of mirrors, like it's almost a mirror of Keela in some way. And I think when I first imagined Ophidia, I did have her in mind as very like a monstrous creature, and that she, would do things kind of out of vengeance. And as I was developing her characters, I started thinking about like, well, vengeance due to what, out of what, and that kind of made her more complex to think about those things. um, and I guess I don't think of her so much as evil anymore. I think that maybe was like a original thought, but now I think of her more as misunderstood and also misguided. Her interactions led her to believe, that humans are a certain way, and are greedy and selfish, and so she just sees them as, kind of the thing that's keeping her from continuing her existence. So she has to make this bargain with this girl, this child, in order to survive. Um, but as she, in this whole bargain where the girl eventually it has trouble fulfilling her promise to return, Ophidia, again, is misunderstanding things. And that, causes her to do things as well. And there's, I think, always this two sides of the story that I enjoyed playing with being able to have them both as POV characters. That was something that took a while to kind of decide was the right fit for the story, but they both kind of tell their side. And the reader kind of sees that everybody doesn't have all of the information, and they're only working off of sometimes assumptions, or just what seems obvious, but there's maybe more behind the scenes. So yeah, I'm hoping that she comes across more as a complex person that people can understand, as opposed to just like the monstrous, dangerous mermaid.
Well, I like that she seemed to be your entry point to the story. And so you maybe were more inspired to give her that layered treatment and that understanding, that empathy, because I feel like an antagonist who is doing evil for the sake of evil, interested in vengeance for the sake of vengeance, that's a flat character. I think that the best antagonists are just a couple of clicks away from us empathizing with them. They believe that what they're doing is the right choice. They're believing that they are the hero of their own story. And if there have been misunderstandings and assumptions and confirmation bias for her in her life experiences, then she could easily arrive at this conclusion about humans.
Yeah, and I think that was the process for me that didn't come until the later drafts, because and over the process of writing the book, the ending had changed a few times, and not giving any spoilers, the final ending of the book is very similar to my original ending of the book, but the reason we changed it in the first version is that Ophidia was just, it didn't seem believable, because she just at that point was just so, evil, and you didn't feel the empathy for her. And so it made the ending kind of seem very strange. And in the process of adding all of the backstory to her and adding the emotions and the reasons, um, then it was like, oh, okay, now this ending could work because you see her more of as a well-rounded creature who has the ability to change and grow based on like what they've learned. Um, but yeah, that layering took some time and some work.
So that's a really interesting kind of craft nugget, a little takeaway there that sometimes it's not the element, right? You're looking at this ending as you originally envisioned it. You're thinking this doesn't work, this doesn't work. Well, sometimes the change doesn't have to do with that element. It has to do with the stuff around it and the context of that element and how you frame it up.
Yes, absolutely. That was definitely that she was a different character in the later revisions, a more rich character that made that able to work when originally it just seemed like it maybe wasn't the right ending, but it was. It just needed work in other areas.
So, speaking of that work, you mentioned working on this project since 2013 and it came out in 2022. So, can you talk us through, hey, I'm not calling that out one way or the other. I think it's great to talk to people who have been working on a project for a while because it normalizes that novels take time. Publishing takes time. So, can you talk us through your journey and how you went from draft to this finished book?
Yeah. So in 2013, I uh, was in the classroom. I had actually just finished working on my master's program and thinking a lot about books and um, the kids and
Master's
like what.
programs tend to do that.
Yes, and so I had a friend who had put a little seed in my head to say, well, maybe there are gaps on the shelves, and books about authors or about protagonists of color written by authors of color, that's a number that still hadn't grown a lot in the years, and needed contributions. And so I was like, yeah, I okay, maybe I will try to write something. And so National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo, is something that I've done since that time. I had discovered it and I thought, okay, that's a good motivation. It sets, kind of a goal to do a fast draft. And I did it with my students. So, as a classroom teacher, they have a young writers program for any kid who's K through 12, and you can adapt it. And so I, in 2012, started doing NaNoWriMo with my students in the classroom. And this book was the second attempt to try to write something. And I said to them, I'm going to ask you to do a novel. Obviously, your word count, the kids get to set their own word counts. They don't have to write 50,000 words like the adults do.
Sure.
But I said, I'm going to do it with you. So we all would sit down and work together. And so I wrote that draft, and in November of 2013, I started it. I won NaNoWriMo, so I did get to 50,000 words on that manuscript. But the novel wasn't finished, obviously. And then, so I kept working on it into the next year. Finally, did finish it in 2014. And then realized that there was just a lot still that I needed to learn. I should have said that before I started trying to write. I, kind of realized that teaching writing and teaching, literature is different than being a creator. And so, I started seeking out, organizations that I could learn from and workshop and classes, and found a critique group and all of that. So, 2014, I'm working on revision and taking classes on revision and working with my critique group. Um, I applied to two different mentorship programs, kind of in that set of years. One was Author Mentor Match, and one was Writing in the Margins, and both accepted me. And the great thing about that was that the two different authors that I worked with, one was a middle grade author and one was a YA author, and they brought different insights to my manuscript. So my middle grade friend now, um, looked a lot and commented to me about voice and, did
Yeah.
things sound like what a 12-year-old would say and think, and work that way. And so that was really helpful. And then my mentor, who was a YA author, very much she is a fantasy writer. And so she looked at, the character building and the world building and, pacing and all of these other things. And so with both of their help, I polished it, finally sent it to Query in 2018. So this is now like years down the road. And then had an offer of representation from my agent. And as I tell my students, first thing that we did was start revising again. And she asked me that on her call is, would you be willing to revise? And I'm like, of course I'd be willing to revise. And so we did at least 3 passes, and it took us about 18 months to make some changes. And part of that was all of those ending changes that I talked about. And then we started querying it, or started sending it on submission in 2019. And so it was a long process, but at that point, I was really excited because there was a lot of interest from the editors who received it, and we went to auction eventually, and ended up with HarperCollins. So a very long journey, but really, kind of making me feel like all the hard work paid off in the end, and ended up with a great, wonderful team and editor who gave me, other wonderful insights. And again, we revised some more
You have to do
until
more revision.
exactly.
Yep. Yeah.
But
This
but
this
yes,
comes as a surprise to a lot of writers. By the time they query a project, they are ready to never see it again, ever.
yep.
And then the agent shows up and is like, hey, I have some notes and some ideas for revision.
Exactly. And, it's funny though, because I think I've said this to my students before that when you get feedback, whether it's from like a critique partner or, agents and others, like, it's really good to listen and just kind of think about like what that person is seeing. And there's definitely feedback that I got from like critique partners early on that I was like, no, 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 that's not what I want, or that's not what, and people would mention something again. And sometimes like I've said to like my students that, what they're suggesting might not be the right fix or the best fit, but like the fact that they're pointing something out is worth like paying attention to. Um, but sometimes they do have good ideas that you should listen to. And so there's some things that like sometimes I would say, no, no, no. And then I'm like, okay, fine. Just because you keep mentioning it, I'll try it. And then I'm like, oh, that was actually really good change. So being open minded
Sometimes
is good.
it's identifying where there might be an issue. Ideally, you'll also get a sense of what the issue is or why it's coming up. But again, that fix may not be it's not the ending that was the issue. It was the framing around the ending. So sometimes you can take feedback at face value, but you can also sort of reverse engineer your action plan from feedback in ways that maybe the person giving feedback didn't anticipate, but it's possible to meet feedback in the middle like that sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that, I've been so fortunate to have, really helpful feedback from people at different stages. And sometimes like they led to like just kind of just like fortuitous changes that like I wouldn't have anticipated. One of the stories I tell is that in a writing class I took, somebody in the class was a writer, but she also was a marine biologist in her day job, and she
Oh,
commented that Keela in that manuscript collected seashells, and she said, this is so great, but I don't know if you know that collecting seashells can be damaging for beaches and environment because of and she mentioned a couple things, and I was like, I'd never heard that before, and I started looking into it and realizing, gosh, it disrupts habitats from animals who use the shells, and it can lead to erosion, and I don't want to add to that. And So I started thinking about what else could Keela be a collector of that might also work with the jewelry that she makes in the story as like part of her hobbies. And that was when I thought about sea glass, and that, sea glass is basically trash. Humans have put it in the ocean, and the ocean is throwing it back at us, and it looks a lot prettier. and and it wasn't until after I said, okay, that's what she's going to collect, and I started looking into the types of sea glass and all of that, that I discovered that folklore story about mermaids' tears. And that was like, oh, like the universe saying, see, that was a good change, because now you have a whole connection and a thread that you can explore that I wouldn't have if she still collected shells. So,
That's really interesting, and it also, as we revise, as a draft starts to pull together, that really is the process toward the end of a writing project, which is finding those connections or creating new connections or sort of finding resonance to what you've already built into your story or what you're revising into the story. So that's fascinating that you found this sort of mythological folklore underpinning for sea glass.
yeah, it just added to, again, this mermaid lore, that, and kind of strengthening the connection to things that people, might be familiar, or stories that are out there with this story that I was creating on my own.
Because that's always that's a question I find in middle grade all the time being asked, either by me giving feedback on a manuscript or in terms of story logic. It's like, why a kid, right? Now, we all know that a 12-year-old, 13-year-old is very, very capable at a lot of things. We don't underestimate them. You would never underestimate your students. That being said, why is this, mythological, maybe eternal being relying on a kid? What is so special about Keela that she is the missing piece of this much bigger story?
Yeah, well, and I think that's where, like, when you mentioned world building, it's like those logical rules, and so they're constraints to Ophidio's magic, and she has to do, because of what her comb represents to her. There are certain, when it's taken by a person, and how she got it, there are certain rules that she has to follow. So as much as she, would love to just go grab it and get it back, like, she can't. Like, there's these constraints that she's got to offer with in exchange, and she's got to wait for the girl to return it. And now her threat, and that she says, is, if you don't, I'm gonna come get you. So there's like that looming, conflict over Keela, that she is gonna get what she wants, but she's got to fulfill her end of the bargain. So there's that. But I think also that Keela, and like what she wants, is very like relatable and understandable to adults and kids. I think even if kids haven't lost a parent like she has in the story, many kids have experienced, loss in other ways, whether it's a pet or a friend going away, or something that, they just wish that things could be back the way they were. Um, so I think that's part of like why her, because, why not her? But, but she's kind of set into this world where she's got to follow certain rules, or else there are consequences as well.
Yeah. And I think it's change. I mean, I still struggle with change. I am a grown adult, or so they say. And this brings me to what I really want to talk about, which is your teaching and how it has sort of informed your writing, your understanding of this age group, this age category. Was it ever a question that you would write anything else than middle grade?
I definitely would not have started with any other age category, because this is the group that I've taught for the longest time, and I have stuck with them because I love this age group, especially the younger middle. In my teaching experience, fifth grade has always been the beginning of the middle school experience in the schools that I've been in. So fifth through eighth grade, and I've taught the older students, and I love them, but there's just the curiosity and the imagination and the enthusiasm of like the younger middle schoolers that I've always loved. Um, and I think in terms of like how like having that experience with them has informed the stories, I think a lot about like what's important to them, what do they care about, and friendship is important. I see and help advise a lot of friendship issues sometimes with students, and also just families. Like they care a lot about their families, the people who love them and take care of them, and they would do anything for them. And I think when kids are older, like they start to become more independent and kind of like push their own identities a little bit more. But I think those younger students, like in the that 8 to 12 year range, just really the what's close to them is most important. And I think how they show that is just so really interesting. And I'm glad I have a little window into that from working with them.
Yeah, and it sounds like in Keela's life and what has recently happened to her, it's this, she's been forced to leave behind this family identity and individuate herself, go out into the big wide world, maybe before she's ready, and make some big choices and choices of consequence, these tough magical quandaries that she is sort of embroiled in. They are big decisions, and decisions that are going to have consequences, that are going to have ramifications, that she's going to have to own. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a parallel for our process as we grow up through these ages of 8 through 12, where we individuate ourselves. We start developing a social persona. We maybe separate a little bit from our family of origin.
hmm And I think one of the things that Keela learns is that she has to still rely on those people who are there to support her. Like she's trying to, just take care of everything on her own, at the beginning, whether that's through like her grieving process, that I don't want to make anybody worry. So I'm just going to, make pretend that everything's okay so that, those people, think that I'm okay. And then even when she's dealing with, this whole magic situation and trying to return this comb, and things start to go wrong, it's like, I'm just going to try to figure it out on my own. And then she comes to realize that I need to tell people. I need to, there are people here who keep saying, extending their hands and extending their hearts and saying, we're here for you, whatever you need. And then she has to kind of realize, okay, all right, I'm going to tell you, and take that help and accept that.
You cannot be a lone wolf as much as you want to. And I think that's one of the interesting tensions of middle grade is we start to become aware that the adults around us are fallible. We start to become aware that not everything is, the way we might have thought with our childlike or our, kid lenses. We start to become more aware of the world. And then the choice is ours whether we want to meet the world where it is and sort of develop this new understanding of what's around us.
Yeah, absolutely. And she does encounter, her father at one point apologizes to her and says, I've been trying to make things easier for you by not talking about your mother's, death, and just, I've made mistakes too, and let's try to be better each for each other.
I think that's lovely. And I don't want you to reveal whether or not she gets her wish. But I would imagine that there is a certain element of acceptance and, rolling with it and dealing with the things that happen to us that I think anybody, but especially an 8 to 12-year-old, needs support with. This idea of just dealing with it, being resilient, being vulnerable, all of these skills that we would love to give to kids without being pushy or overtly preachy. but it sounds like you've really found a way to, because what you said earlier was you're a premise writer, which I hardly never get to hear from an author. It sounds like you're telling like a quintessential coming of age story, but with this fictional fantasy folklore adaptation wrapper that has really found you this sweet spot in the middle grade market.
Yeah, thank you. I think what you said too about like accepting change, like is a big part of that. And I think realizing um, like your own like fallibility that you can make mistakes and then you can learn from those mistakes and change and that you'll be okay in the end is kind of like an important lesson that she and Ophidia have to learn. So
That's right. Ophidion's on her own change arc, her own growth trajectory. Um, is this a standalone? Is it a series? Do you have more books planned? What's the deal looking forward?
yeah, I this is a standalone, but I've been having some school visits where students keep talking to me about like, oh, you should. Even had one little boy write a note and gave me an idea about that Keela and Lissy go off looking for like jewelry, people who stole jewelry, and like also, so there are definitely people who are interested in me continuing the story in some way. I don't know. I keep thinking that there's definitely lots more to explore with the mermaid world. So that's something that I might have to start thinking about. But I am working on another manuscript right now. I had a two-book deal. And so my second book hopefully will come out next fall. We'll see. It doesn't get everything, the timeline keeps changing for so many things right now. But
Yes.
yeah, it's another standalone fantasy set kind of in a totally different world and place. It's actually in a desert, so opposite of the ocean and the beach. But yeah, so I'm excited to kind of keep playing with this idea of like folk tales and fairy tales and storytelling and history, even though it's in a different characters and different setting.
Oh, interesting. So that is sort of becoming your authorial brand.
I don't know. Maybe this is will be only be book two, so I'll have to see where it goes from there. But I do. I would always, I would love to, do a retelling at some point. You mentioned that adaptions and retelling, and I think that would be really great to like tackle a story and think about like how would I want to retell it. So I think fantasy for sure is someplace that I'm happy to stay for a little while as I'm getting myself, establish and learning my craft still, even as I'm writing books. But yeah, I'd love to do more with fairy tales and folklore.
So, what to you? I'm going to put you on the spot because this is such a tough thing to define. But what to you makes a successful premise? Then, if we're sort of looking at your future, how are you going to cherry pick your story ideas, and what elements are you looking for when you know that you've hit upon your next idea?
Mhm. I'd like to ask kind of what if questions, like, what if this were true, or what if that were true? I had I have a partial draft of something that came from a what if that my students, one year we used to do like a word of the day. And so, there was for some reason, the word of the day, kids kept picking phobias. And, this, agoraphobia and like, all of these
They're such
phobias.
great phobia words.
They are. And so I just started thinking about, like these idea of like things that you fear. And then like, what if you could see them? What if there was somebody who could see them? What if, people could talk to them? And so, things like that. Like I also, for this manuscript that I'm working on, it's kind of a girl in the tower story. So, it started again, same thing. What if, so instead of a, princess in the tower, what if, a princess rescued a princess in a tower? So I like to kind of think about like how you might flip something or look at it in a different way.
I really like that. I like that approach because it's like improv. There are no bad ideas in improv. You may not run with all of them, but in improv, we say yes and you sort of build upon an idea that way. And the what if question is just a beautiful one to fire up the imagination.
Yeah, it's great for just like, making a list of things and so I've got like a list of things that, at some point like when I finish the next thing and I'm ready to start something new, I might go back to that list as a starting point and say, "Did any of those ideas resonate at the moment?" and then try them out.
And do your students know to expect royalties for their contributions to
I
your
know.
brainstorming?
There's so many, over the years where, I think that was one of the interesting things is, as I said, I wrote the first draft of the book in 2013, and those students are now um, freshmen in college. So
Oh my
like they're
goodness.
way older, and but like over the years, I've had students say like, can you give me a copy of can you print a copy of my of your book? And just like the way publishing works, like they had no idea at first, but now the ones that I have now are pretty knowledgeable. They know that books tend to be published on a Tuesday. Like I'll
Yeah.
mention something coming out and
Yes.
they'll go, "That's a Tuesday, isn't it?" I'm like, "It probably is." So their publishing knowledge has risen.
That is very cool. Do you use them to get feedback, or is that just a hard no?
No, I really do. So they I mentioned doing NaNoWriMo with them, and so this year when we put our novels aside for about a month after November just to let them cool off and clear our heads and have fresh eyes. And when we came back, I started talking to them about critique groups and that I was going to have, what the difference between a critique group and like peer editing that they're used to, which, we're not just correcting spelling and fixing capitalization. We want to think about like the story and like what is the writer trying to say and maybe give them a chance to answer or ask questions. And so to model that, I show them a piece of work. So I showed them actually the first chapter of this manuscript that I'm working on and let them read it. And then they got to, we practiced sandwich feedback. So what I liked, what I'm wondering about, or what I have a suggestion about, and then something else. And I got a lot of feedback. They gave me their notes at the end. So
Oh, that is fabulous. And by asking them to put their work aside for a month, you have set them up for such success. I wish a lot of NaNoWriMo recent winners would take that cooling off period to just develop some
it's
fresh eyes.
so helpful. And I think in the school situation, it's probably a rare opportunity that they have because so often we're like, we've got to get to the next thing. And so it's like write, revise, turn in a final draft and move on. And so a lot of the kids will tell me like, for when they're older, I love NaNoWriMo. It was one of the most fun writing activities that we did. And the fact that it's not just in November, it really takes us to the end of the year because we, have that cooling off and then we come back. And it's so funny that they'll say, "Oh, I love this story." And then after the month has passed, "I hate this story." It's so bad. And it's like everybody
They
says
are now
that.
ready to be writers. If you
Exactly.
love it one day, hate it the next day, can't even look at it, that is the writing life,
That
right?
it's everybody feels that.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much for sharing your idea, your thinking, your story craft, your teaching insights. Your students and now your readers are so lucky to have you and our listeners as well. This has been Lisa Stringfellow with her debut, A Comb of Wishes, out now from HarperCollins Quiltree Books. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
It was wonderful chatting with you. And I am Mary Cole with Good Story Podcast. Here's to a good story.